The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Travis McGrath from Exago. Thanks for joining us on today's Support Lab. Just to make sure everyone can see my screen all right, you should be looking at a slide that says Exago Support Lab v2019.2, Customizing the Color Picker. And you can hear me okay. Just type a yes, a hello, a good morning, whatever you'd like in the questions panel of the GoToWebinar on the bottom right side of your screen. Of course, everyone here will be on mute for the lab if you haven't joined us before. That isn't to say we don't want questions. We don't want this to be interactive. So if you have any questions at any point, today's going to be a little bit of a short lab, but we're going to dive into a little bit of code. So if ever you want something backed up or covered again, just let me know and I'm happy to go into more detail here. Awesome. So today's lab, we'll jump right into it, is going to be, just as an overview, our objective here is to give a sneak peek of one small addition in our 2019.2 release. We're going to have a full webinar of this release on February 5th at 2 p.m. A link to sign up for that webinar is available on both our main website and our support portal. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at this one addition, which is how a user selects colors when they're designing a report. They're trying to make the report look good. And we're going to show how this can actually be customized in 19.2. This customization is going to take advantage of what we call user preferences. So we're going to give a quick overview of user preferences. And then we're going to show how the customization works. Okay, so let's jump right into it. So in 19.2, there are a lot of new features, and today's focus is going to be the color picker. This is going to be a comparison of our 19.1 color picker, where we have a grid of colors, and a user can type in a hex value. So if they have a specific branding color, they can just type in your basic hex value. And in 19.2, we've expanded this out a little bit to give the user a little bit easier of a time if they don't know the exact hex color and they don't like sort of the basic group of colors that are available here. So what we've done is we've added a gradient box where a user can easily select from a full gradient across the whole spectrum. They can still use hex colors if they want, and they can also use RGB colors. In addition to that, down below, we of course have some preset colors that we think give a good range of samples. And this is going to be the key for today's focus, we have a row of recently used or what we call favorite colors. So here a user can add a color, so they can select the color they want, hit the plus button, and it'll be stored for that user for later. So this is going to be the main focus of today. And our objective with these favorite colors is going to be to extend that. That is to say, to set some favorite colors for our users by default. So a user won't have to go into the full application and choose all their favorite colors and have them stored. There will already be some that match their preferences throughout the rest of the host application or their company's branding, however you want to do it here. Okay, so the question is, if we're going to store favorite colors for our users before they even get into the application, well, where's this information kept? And you might guess from the objectives earlier that these are kept in user preferences. So user preferences is its own topic, and in fact, this is actually a support lab that we've conducted in the past. There are a couple of different ways to store user preferences. Just as a brief overview, if you want the full details and some code sample on how to do this, you can check out these the past support lab. It's both available on our YouTube channel and, of course, with all the other support labs on our knowledge base. But user preferences can be kept in local storage in the browser or can be handled by what we call a server event to store the user preference however you want. Most of the time, though, that means storing it into a database. So we're going to take this knowledge that we can store the favorite colors in user preferences in a database, and we're going to do something with it. So specifically, we're going to store their personal favorites, and we're going to set it so when Exago says, hey, we're loading this user's user preferences for Travis. What are the favorite colors? What do we want to set as the default custom colors? And we're going to add some custom colors there. Okay, so let's get out of the slides and let's look at an example. So here I've pulled up a local installation of my 19.2. I've opened my ExpressView Designer and just added a couple of fields. And key note here is that this is the first time I've come in here. I haven't added any colors beforehand. You'll just have to trust me on that one, but I'm going to show you the code in a minute. And when I open up the color picker here, I'll see an additional row, in this case, some sort of pastel colors that my admin, or in this case, I've set up locally to be the default when a user first comes in. So where did these colors come from and how do we handle these? Well, so what we're doing here is we're using our server and action events that we detailed actually in the last support lab on user preferences. So I'm going to jump into some code here. And we're creating a method. There's one method to retrieve user preferences and one to set. And so our normal set method is just taking a value passed by Exago and it's storing it. It's doing an insert into the database and it's inserting that value entirely unchanged. It's just saying, hey, when Exago gives me a user preference based on the active user, the session info variables, things like that, I'm just storing that information. I'm keeping track of what type of user preference and what values Exago has given me. Right, so our set method here is pretty simple. It's basically saying insert it if there isn't already one, or update it if one already exists. But we're going to write some code that does something a little bit more clever. And so what we're going to do here is first go over to our database where we've inserted some general records. Some user preferences, and in our user preference storage table, we're keeping track by user, so using that user ID, we're looking up the type of user preference, and in this case, I want to look at these general user preferences. These can be a lot of things, and what we'll notice is that these are JSON arrays. So here there are a bunch of different properties that are stored within a general user preference, and if I just drill into it, so in this case I'm just editing it, I can look and I notice that one of them is called color picker custom colors. And so what we can do is we can set our code to say, hey, when Exago hands me a new general user preference, look to see if there are any color picker custom colors. And if there aren't, let's add some by default that match, the active user or whatever else we want to keep as the criteria for which colors we want as the default favorites. So to do that, we can create one new additional method. And what it's going to do is we're going to call this on set user preference with custom colors. So it's going to be called by Exago instead of our regular set user preference method. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at that ID and we're going to say if the ID is general and we already don't have custom color picker colors, then we're going to parse this value as a JSON object. We're going to find, and then we're going to add the property color picker custom colors, and we're going to add our own custom values here. These are going to be the defaults for every user. In this particular example, I kept it very simple. We just hard-coded in a number of sort of pastel colors, but of course this could be more dynamic. You could use the session info object to pull this out of a parameter. You could determine who the user is and do some other complex logic to intuit which colors you want. But in this case, we're just keeping the example very simple. Once we've added that custom property in the JSON object, we're going to turn it back into a string. And then we're just going to call the same onset user preference method we already had in place and we covered in the previous lab. In this case, that's going to be the value that was passed to us by Exago plus these custom colors. And then the last piece here is if we're not in the general preferences, we don't want to make any changes. We don't want to break anything else. So we're just going to pass that along and say, hey, no changes needed. This is an if-else statement. Pretty simple. In terms of code, that's really it. It's just a couple of lines of code. But what this does is it gives us that default out of the box to match for our user, our host applications branding, or whatever color preferences we want within here. So if I come back here, now I look and I see that those are the same custom colors down below. And if a user wants to, of course, they can remove them and they won't be re-added. So it's up to the user to determine if they want to change these. But this gives you the ability to customize and add additional options here. Okay, a couple of great questions came in, so I'm going to answer a few of them here. So one question said, is a user preference specific to a user or to all users? And this is a great question, and there's a little bit of an it depends behind it. So in general, user preferences are specific to a user because when a user preference is stored, if we're using that set user preference method here, oops, if I just scroll up, I can see it here. It is using from the session info object the user ID that's been passed by the host application. So in general, a single user preference is going to be specific to an individual user, assuming that the host application here is passing a user ID, which is definitely a recommendation by Exago. If you want to, you can, of course, be more sophisticated. You could have certain user preferences that are specific to companies or groups or departments. But our out-of-box example, the one we provide and is covered in our support lab, as well as this support lab, of course, is to have them be individual to a user. Okay. So jumping back in here, that's really it. That was a pretty quick code example, a very simple feature. It's just a small customization on a UI change here, and somewhat of a sneak peek. So the other question that came in is, when is version 2019.2 going to be available for download? And the target is to have it come out later this week or early next week. So there's a few things still in the works there on our release, but it should be available in just a few days here. Great question came in on user preferences. Could you set them for multi-tenancy, or that is to say for multiple clients? Absolutely. So the way server events control user preferences, you can certainly set different user preferences for different users or clients, because when those user preferences are saved, you have access to the session info object. You can inspect parameters like the user ID or the company ID, and you can adjust how they're stored and how they're retrieved. So user preferences absolutely can be used individually, or you can be more sophisticated in your code that stores and retrieves them and have them handled in a multi-tenant or multi-client environment as well. So those are two great questions. I just want to pause here. Like I said, today's lab was intentionally a little short. We wanted to give you a sneak peek, and we know that there's a webinar for the full 19.2 features coming up, so I didn't want to steal too much thunder from there. I do want to mention, though, that this year we're going to move forward with only having one support lab per month. So next month's support lab is going to be a deep dive on the dashboard designer changes in version 2019.2. So we're going to cover it on the 5th in our release webinar, but that's going to give a cursory summary of those changes. We're going to do deep dive in February. And then in March, we're going to talk about a technical feature that's available in 19.2, which is the ability to make custom aggregate functions in addition to a regular custom function. So we're going to show some examples. That'll dive into a little more code. And again, that'll be a deep dive. Of course, there will be an initial explanation of both those new features in our 19.2 overview on the 5th. Awesome. So with that, I want to pause and see if there are any other questions. Okay, great. I don't see any coming in, so we'll call the lab there. And I just want to say thanks for joining us today and happy reporting.